Greetings from Washington, D.C. This is Khalil Jahshan, Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C., welcoming you to this special webinar today, focusing on MENA economies in crisis, global shocks, structural challenges, and prospects for reform. The Middle East and North Africa, known as MENA, have been struggling with one of the world's worst economic crises following the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, beginning in 2019 and ending technically in May of 2023, and high inflation arising from the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine and impact on global energy supply, both of which have contributed to the prevailing global economic downturn. Countries in the MENA region, according to the World Bank, are generally facing a variety of economic challenges, including high inflation, rising fuel and food prices, disrupted global supply chains, the world's highest youth unemployment rates, falling wages, currency depreciation, rampant corruption and structural economic weaknesses, and financial and debt crises. One of the most recent World Bank reports, actually the one that was released in April, first week of April, it's three months old. The World Bank, in that report entitled Altered Destinies, the long-term effects of rising prices and food insecurity in the Middle East and North Africa, the World Bank forecasts MENA's GDP will slow to 3.0 in 2023 from 5.8 in 2022. Oil exporters who benefited from the windfall of 2022 will experience, according to the report, slower growth, but a large gap between high-income countries and the rest of the region will emerge. Real GDP, according to the report, this is GDP per capita growth, which is a better proxy for living standards, is expected to slow down to 1.6% in 2023 from the 4.4% we witnessed in 2022. So while import-dependent Arab economies are confronting these obstacles, oil-producing countries in the Gulf, of course, with their own ambitious development plans for the next few years, are facing the need to diversify their economies. Drastic increases in the cost of living across the region have made life even much more miserable for an already aggrieved population, and more people are falling into poverty, according to international reports. This combination of global shocks and internal shortcomings is threatening to bring about an economic, social, and political collapse with potentially catastrophic results for the whole region. In light of these developments, Arab Center Washington, D.C. has convened this panel of renowned regional experts to discuss the already tough and intensifying economic challenges facing the MENA region today, particularly the Arab members of the region, as well as opportunities for growth and economic progress, and we'll be focusing on some key questions. I'll just highlight a couple of them. They have been shared with the speakers, and they will be each focusing on their assigned questions to avoid redundancy, if you will. The first question is, what are the major socioeconomic and institutional challenges facing different countries and populations in the region? What are the political and social implications of these economic conditions? How are governments in the region responding? Are they coping? Are they doing well? What political and economic reforms are needed? What monetary and fiscal policy recommendations can be provided to help accelerate structural reforms and bolster growth and resilience in local or regional economies? Our panelists today are well known. They do not need extensive introductions, so I'll just briefly identify them in their current positions. More information is available on our website and in their bios. And I will be introducing them in the order they will be speaking. First, Tariq Youssef, Senior Fellow and Director of Middle East Council on Global Affairs based in Doha, Qatar. And Tariq will be focusing on a general assessment of economic conditions in MENA, internal structural challenges, reforming public sectors, opportunities, and recommendations. Basma Momani, Professor of Political Science, University of Waterloo. She will be focusing on the external factors, the expanding financial and debt crises in the region, assessment of austerity measures, and the IMF policy recommendations for the region. Manal Shihabi is academic visitor at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford, and founding director of Shear Research and Advisor. Manal will be focusing on energy issues, impact of the global energy crisis on MENA economies, economic challenges and opportunities for oil-producing countries. And last but not least, Noor Arafi will be, who's a fellow at the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center, will be focusing on the food crisis and food insecurity, problems with food production and agricultural labor, import dependency, recommendations for food justice in the region. Each speaker will speak for 12 minutes. And after that, we will have about 30 minutes left, which we will dedicate to a Q&A discussion with the audience. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom page. Or if you would rather send it via email, send it to events@arabcenterdc.org. That is events@arabcenterdc.org. If you would care to address your question to a particular panelist, feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll just pass it on to the whole panel. And with that, let me go ahead and pass the microphone on to Tariq. Tariq, you have 12 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Khalil, for the kind introduction, and to the Arab Center for hosting this important debate on the regional economies, their present conditions, and the future. I think listening to you initially, and reading also the panel's discussion, I struggled a bit with what appeared to be a grim picture about present conditions and the future economic outlook. And I have to admit that I found myself largely in agreement with this for plenty of reasons, some of which you've outlined, starting with, the last just few years focusing on what happened. We all recall the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the pandemic recession. A recession that lasted longer than most people expected, had cost the region not just fiscal resources, but had in fact set back and erased years of gains in socioeconomic development, whether it's wages, job security, social security systems, rising vulnerabilities, rising inequalities, all of which became glaringly clear and was amplified by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession associated with it, largely across the board. Of course, the GCC countries, and we'll continue to distinguish them throughout the day here, were slightly different and behaved differently from the rest of the region on account of their immense fiscal wealth, fiscal resources, and the manner in which they were able to deploy this very effectively in a lot of cases. But by and large, this was a very costly period. As such, the region anticipated very optimistically and very hopefully the return of normalcy after the end of the pandemic. And to some extent, that did happen. We saw the beginning of a recovery in 2022. High oil prices, tourism was back, economic activity, job creation, and all of which. And this was reflected in the outcomes by and large of what happened last year, meaning 2022 was a much better year than 2021 and 2020. But just as the region was beginning to recover, as you rightly pointed out, it was hit by a number of external shocks that had a devastating effect. Some of them had to do with, the dislocation in the international system and the world economy after COVID. the so-called supply chain bottlenecks and the associated frictions that we all experienced. But a lot of them had to do with external events elsewhere. The war in Ukraine did send both fuel and food prices to levels not seen in a decade. And that proved to be much more costly than many of us had initially suspected. I would just point to one survey that came out mid of last year, suggesting that a majority of people in the region, again, the non-GCC countries, had reported that they ran out of money before they could acquire all their food needs in a given period of time. And this was before the full impact of the commodity price spikes was transmitted into the region, all of which meant that 2022, as the international system began to cope with inflation, would change from a very hopeful initial start to a period where you've got rising inflationary pressures, rising food prices, widening food insecurity. And now you see the other effects that I'm sure Besma is going to talk a lot about. Interest rates spikes around the world, financial tightening, growing vulnerabilities, a sense of uncertainty and fear about the future, which even if you happen to be a GCC country with ample financial resources and fiscal capacities, you would have to take into account and keep in mind that the world economy is likely to enter into a recession. With it, all the potential dislocation and negative spillovers. I think it would be unfair, though, to say that it was only the events that I pointed to that account for why 2023 is a year where everything in the region, across the board, perhaps with the exception of Saudi Arabia, is rather subdued. There's a sense of anxiety and uncertainty about the future, a lot of risk aversion, a lot of fiscal conservatism, even within the countries that have resources. And we've got countries that have actually now are experiencing the kind of pressures on their exchange rates, pressure on their debt burdens, pressures on their macroeconomic sustainability that has not been seen in a generation. Countries that I'm sure Besma is going to allude to that are unable to reach a deal with the IMF, partly because conditions have changed. It would be, however, unfair, Khalil, to point the finger only at the last 18 months or 2 years, or even COVID, and say that this accounts for where we are today and why the region seemingly is adrift. I would describe it, is adrift in so many levels, is losing gains that it had made and investments in socioeconomic development in the previous couple of decades. I would say the entire decade, the last decade, was a lost one for the region. It started with a very hopeful moment around the Arab Spring protests, hopes for a political transition, and the renewal of political life and public life. But then it witnessed the collapse of oil prices, political chaos, instability, civil wars in 3-4 countries, growing geopolitical competition amongst countries, very costly, economically very costly ventures, all of which, in fact, would lead one very conservatively to suggest that the entire last decade had set the region back. And now the region is slowly perhaps recovering, will have to recover, but will have to do so with very difficult, very different conditions, both domestically and abroad. And let me just outline some of this before I stop. Why the future, in my view, notwithstanding the fact that the challenges are clear, what needs to happen is clear, why the future is going to be much more uncertain and difficult for us to get a handle on, and difficult for policymakers in the region to also cope with the exception, of course, of countries that have what you might call the fiscal space, the policy space, that have invested heavily in their autonomy, both on the foreign policy front, but also on the economic front. The international system has entered the period of uncertainty. So forget for a moment the fact that inflation is going to be with us for a while to come, and it's going to be double digits in a lot of countries in the region. And a cost of living crisis is going to become much more mainstream. And a number of countries are going to be pushed to the point of potentially defaulting on their debt if rescue does not come fast enough and generously enough and robustly enough to calm markets and to calm those who hold their debt. These countries now have to cope with growing geopolitical competition between the US, Russia, and China. This geopolitical competition is presenting them with challenges, but also opportunities. China is not the former Soviet Union. It's not just a strategic rival, it's also an economic rival. It offers things to countries. It's in a region in Asia that is now the center of a lot of growth in the international system, and where more and more countries in the region are beginning to do more trade with and look to more investment with moving forward. Many of these countries, especially in the Gulf, are going to be thinking about hedging and balancing between the US and China and others. But they're also mindful of the fact that the international economic system is also changing. We're not talking about globalization anymore in the way we did in 2010 or 2000. Globalization is evolving, it's changing. The world is deglobalizing, according to some people, and reglobalizing. National security considerations are driving trade and are driving investment, which is going to make it really hard for a lot of countries in the region to sort of navigate through all of this, make policy choices now that affect their local economies, while at the same time balancing and hedging until things settle and become clear, if they do, in the coming period. The former structural reform agenda that was widely, I think, pushed on countries, and rightly so, a decade ago, is no longer necessarily the only route forward to dealing with socioeconomic problems, dealing with challenges that you spoke about. The state is back. State machinery is back. State industrial policy is back. Look at the Gulf countries. They're combining their immense financial resources with a lot of state initiatives to drive diversification, to try to drive different outcomes. Can Egypt do this? Can Jordan do this? Can Tunisia do this? What happens to Iraq? A group of countries in the region will have to pick and choose and figure out what works for them at a moment when it's no longer clear what the right thing is to do, partly on account of this uncertainty I've tried to describe, geopolitically, geoeconomically, but also in the world of ideas. If you wanted to be a part of globalization a decade ago, globalization has evolved and moved to where now it is about favored trade and investment, relationships and specific partnerships that serve you. It's about technological change. All of this, Khalil, is by way of trying to say that the challenge for the fiscally strapped, the developmentally challenged countries in the region is going to be immense moving forward. It is no longer about implementing ideas that are already made, widely accepted. It's about thinking through what is going to work in the coming period and trying to create enough political space within their own domestic societies and polities to have agreement, consensus, support, public support for this. This is going to be very hard to do if the only regimes one can imagine surviving and remaining resilient and strong in the region are going to be the ones led by strong men who lead alone, who lead without any accountability, and lead with minimal transparency. I think this would be what is different about our discussion today from a discussion, let's say, that would have taken place a few years ago or a decade ago. I'll stop here, Khalil, and look forward to the rest of my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Tariq. A lot of food for thought. We asked for a general assessment, and we got it. So thank you very much. I'm sure this will generate a lot of inquiries during the question and answer period. Next is Basma Mani, Professor of Political Science, University of Waterloo. Basma, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead. You got 12 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Khalil, and thank you for assembling this fantastic panel. I'm really excited to be on stage, so to speak, with all these great minds. So let me just pick up a few things. Dotted really, I think we think alike on a lot of issues, so this may be a bit repetitive, but I'll try to sort of think of things that hasn't been said. Well, that was a really great overview. I mean, geopolitics has never mattered so much for economic conversations like it does today. And I say this as a political scientist who's been working on international political economy issues for over 20 years. And certainly, I think for those of us who watch the region, the Arab Spring felt like the moment of great time for IPE analysis, if you will. But I actually think it's actually even more academically interesting, if not painful for the people on the ground, not to take that away, but in terms of an academic and analyst, it certainly is very interesting what we're seeing today, partly because I think, and I'll pick up on a few of these tensions, we're in a global economic space that's really uncertain. The word uncertainty keeps being thrown around by even those that I think that I've leaned on to really give me, their big picture of what they see happening as trends in the global economy, particularly. And that's, of course, because of the Ukraine-Russia war. Certainly, I think, that has put oil prices in enormous uncertainty. We've seen it decline over the past year. There was the one high, of course, during the initial invasion of February 2022, but it's continued to go down, and that's really perplexed everybody. And the short of it, and I don't want to go into too much history because it's the wrong region, but the short of it is that Russian oil is very much on market. It's on tap, it's being sold, it's being bought mostly by India, Turkey, China, countries that will frankly not care about the global economic sanctions regime. And the economic sanctions regime itself is not overly it's nothing like the multilateral ones that we saw, for example, on Iran during its signing of the nuclear agreement, partly because I think the health of the global economy was already so uncertain coming out of COVID that I think the powers that be just didn't want to completely shut it out. And not to mention, we are in a global geopolitical environment today where you can't tell India, Turkey, and other countries what to do in the same way that of the past. There is this new sense of confidence. It's nationalism, certainly led by a lot of populist nationalist leaders globally, and we see that everywhere. But this global fragmentation, some call it the decline of the liberal international order, it's really, I think, in my view, to just give you the shortcut of it, a real challenge to American hegemony. And that's partly because I think people, globally are very critical of decades of American foreign policy that has gone awry. Certainly the sense of, I think, for those in the Arab world watching what's happening in terms of the reaction to what I think is an absolute slaughter of Ukraine, and this is not to take away the pain and suffering of Ukrainians, but one is seeing the Russian pounding Ukraine and complete hypocrisy coming from the West in terms of the disproportionate attention to what's happening on the Ukrainians and complete silence and if you will, ignorance for what's happening in other parts of the world. So this idea of fighting for democracy, an idea of fighting for the liberal international order really rings hollow when we look at all these other crises that continue to be ignored by the West for convenience sake or geopolitical sake. So I say that all because I think we're in a very difficult time where, unlike 2008, which I was an analyst of at the time, you saw the world really come together in the G20 to come and kind of solve the problems that be. And we saw, I think, a honeymoon period of global cooperation then. So many of us were writing about, the future of globalization, international cooperation. And that really just seems like it's not, it may be decades away before we go back to that moment of international cooperation for the reasons that I mentioned. But again, it's multifaceted. As I said, it's the rise of nationalist populist leaders in many of these countries, these middle powers, or, again, second tier great powers, India and the rest. But it's also a reality that there is this new sense of, the Americans, you can't tell us what to do. We've got options. And here's the pickle, if you will, I think, overall, is what that means is that I think there is a bit of a head in the sand. Sorry, I hope I didn't get disconnected. Sorry, my son always calls the wrong time. Anyhow, so I think this really just points out that what I was hoping to get at, which is that the global political environment is less cooperative, and that has a spillover effect to many Arab economies. Look, the Middle East is not an autonomous actor in its economic situation. By that I mean, China is its greatest trading partner. Almost all countries in the region have China as their number one, if not European Union as a number two. The European Union is in its own disarray. I'd point out politically, it's on the march towards increased, I don't want to say fascism, but absolutely right-wing populist governments coming to power increasingly there and getting stronger by the day. So it's quite scary to watch. And I think it's only going to get worse, seeing the demographic challenges and the migration challenges facing it just seem to point towards that. And oil, of course, we all know, has such an important role in the economy of the Middle East writ large, whether it's workers' remittances, which of course the non-oil countries very much depend on, or those that actually export oil, like the Gulf countries in particular. Declining oil prices is a challenge. And I say that even for the rich oil countries, because what they recognize increasingly is that, and they have great plans, as Tariq mentioned, in terms of diversification demands. Saudi Arabia is on an absolute boom. Saudi Arabia is an absolute boom, certainly. But I think the challenge here is that they still need international funding. They need international investment. I mean, even if you look at Saudi Arabia's big plans for NEOM, the line, the rest of it, they're basically banking on international investors coming and supporting those projects. So they can't go it alone either. But if you look at the international investment climate, it's quite interesting in that the Middle East does not seem to be a safe place to invest. The Chinese are absolutely willing to put money towards things like infrastructure and resource extraction because it serves their grand purposes, but they're not your typical investors in things like NEOM and the rest. They're very calculating. So Western investors, I think, are holding on to their money tight, don't want to invest currently, I think, in the Middle East, and frankly are watching the entire global economy with a lot of uncertainty, not sure if interest rates are going to go up. They seem to keep going up. But still hoping that there'll be a cooling off period because the recession hasn't come, and so we're all kind of sitting here wondering how heated is this economy when unemployment is still at decent levels or acceptable levels, let's say. Other than housing, I mean, many of us in the West are really wondering where's the inflation. Where's the craziness of inflation that needs or requires such high hiking of interest rates? So I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the global economy and in the Western economies as well. Let me get to what I think is a broader geostrategic challenge facing the world, and that's the US-China tech war. I think this has become such an important part of our need for understanding the health of the future of the global economy. I agree, we're not deglobalizing, as Tariq said, but we are perhaps localizing supply chains. By that, I mean, there's this idea that there's going to be parallel supply chains, one for one market and one for the other, and you use totally different suppliers for each. Look, the illusion of unfettered globalization is over. I think it's become even for, I'm going to give you a Canadian perspective, who 85% of our trade was with the United States. The conversation here in quiet circles is we can't depend on the US as our greatest economic ally. And that's because protectionism in the United States, in your own country, has become extremely vocal. There's only one consensus point that I would say is a bipartisan congressional agreement, and that's basically tough on China, protectionism or protectionist light. There's just nobody in favor of globalization. It's not the 1990s and not the early 2000s. And so I think there is just what we're going to see increasingly, and I think the populist nationalist argument for increased protectionism or protectionist light is getting stronger in every country, including even, I would even argue, in Canada. We have the rise of a populist nationalist who will put to shame what you think is a Canadian model. And so again, there's so many of these bottom-up forces and top-down forces that I think are just going to complicate things. And the Arab region is not isolated. Again, depending on oil is a big problem. The fact that it has, and I know this argument that Tariq said, which I do think sometimes can be beneficial, kind of playing off the West and East against each other, right? There is this bit of a rivalry. And so you do see this, what we call in academic circles, forum shopping, or an attempt to sort of go to one party for a sweet deal. And then if you don't get it, then go to the other party and just play off each other. I don't think that's going to work in the same way, partly because I think the West is going to hold on to its cash. It's become far more interested in absolutely industrial policy. The state is back, but it's a protectionist state. It's not a state that wants to trade or invest globally. So I hope that gives a bit of flavor to where I'm thinking things are going globally and from that macro perspective, and really look forward to the insights of the other panelists.
Thank you, Basma. A lot of food for thought also. And let's go ahead and pass the microphone now to Manal, who is academic visitor at St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. Go ahead, Manal.
Thank you very much, Khalid, and I'm delighted to be with you today and with a wonderful panel, and very excited to join this fantastic panel. So you've asked me to talk about the energy side of things, and I think both Tariq and Basma have already alluded to some of the important points here. In the intro, I think you kind of grouped the area. Of course, I'm talking about the Middle East from in the Arab countries of the Middle East. You've said, oil exporting versus oil importing, and I think I would take it a bit to a more nuanced level and say maybe rich oil exporting economies, and then you have more economically challenged oil exporting economies, and then you have a third group, which is oil and gas importing economies, and those, or net importing, I would say, to include Egypt in this group. And there are variations across each of the three buckets, but I think it's important to look at them more as three general buckets, because within the variation, there are still similarities to look at. So perhaps I'll look at first at the rich oil and gas exporting economy. So we're talking about GCC countries, of course. Mind you, there are variations. So Bahrain and Oman are more or less economically and resource endowed than, for example, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE and, of course, Kuwait. But here, and I think Tariq had alluded to this or mentioned this at the beginning, that there was really a big shock from COVID because you had an expansion of the domestic expenditures, of course, but then also a big collapse of the oil and gas prices. So you had a massive decline of revenue with a big expansion of expenditures, having to take money from sovereign wealth funds. And I think that also was within existing plans of all of these Gulf states who had these visions, which were like between 2030 and 2040. So you have a point in time that's more or less medium point of view, future. And then in my opinion, it was kind of almost like the Gulf economies had a taste, if you will, of what it would mean to not have exports of oil and gas, which is kind of a vision of the future when we're talking about the global energy transition away from fossil fuels. So that was kind of, I think, a shock at many levels. Of course, globally, it was a shock, and there was rise in inflation and disruption of supply chains, et cetera. But on the energy front particularly, I do think that it was kind of like almost a taste, a reality check of what the global energy transition would mean for these economies. And if you see a bit fast forward into a big COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, we saw for the first time really a change, of course, from Gulf economies being previously very opposing to supporting the global energy transition or global decarbonization effort to all of a sudden joining that. So, UAE announced net zero emissions by 2050. followed by Saudi Arabia by 2060. And then last year, a year later, we had also Bahrain following with similar commitments, as well as Oman and Kuwait. So you have a really interesting now, all of a sudden, you have the visions 2030, 2040 timeframe, but then also a new timeframe in the future, which is more 2050, 2060. And these are, one is more midterm and one is long-term. And at first glance, it looks like these are really connected because diversification efforts as part of the visions should be related to the energy transition project. But in a way they are, and in a way they are not. So I think what was really saving for the Gulf states was obviously the Russia-Ukraine war, like Basma mentioned, with the rise of the prices that it generated. And then all of a sudden, it almost flipped to the point that we now even forget in some GCC countries that there was a crisis. And there is this feeling that now all of the rise and the big revenue that's coming from oil and gas export rents, of course, that's funneled into a lot of expansion of projects on the diversification front, whether it's tourism, whether it's in Oman, for example, there is new economic cities that have been announced. Saudi Arabia have purchased, Gulf industry and or the sports, as well as, attracting, and whether it's sports or whether it's new tourism areas. So you can see advancements in these fronts. The same with UAE, really advancing a lot, the energy, the more renewable energy technology fronts as well. So the oil and gas rise of the price has really funneled a lot of the money to really support the diversification plans, but also the so-called energy transition plans. And we see expansion, if you will, on two fronts. The first one is renewable energy. And this is part, these plans actually were pre the net zero emission targets. All of the Gulf states had massive, given their point of start, it were really ambitious targets of renewable energy adoption, anywhere from 15% in the case of Kuwait, all the way to 50% for UAE and Saudi and others by 2050 or so. And then that was more on the domestic front. And then there are the new expanding energy transition projects that really have accelerated post announcing the net zero emissions, which are more on renewable energy for exports, but also the big one, which is hydrogen, especially clean hydrogen for green hydrogen, which is NEOM, the project that Basma mentioned, and also expanding the really technology for absorbing carbon into either absorbing it or storing it in the ground or recycling it in some form. So the energy outlook, so to speak, in a way, it looks like we are diversifying in the Gulf away from fossil fuels, but in reality, we're not. In reality, the region really is still very much behind its targets from renewable energy. It's about still less than 2% across all the countries of the GCC, with the exception of the UAE, which is around 7% or so, but very much behind the targets and behind other oil importing economies. And at the same time, there is a lot of the advancing or accelerating energy transition projects are really targeting the export market. So in a way, it's very much the Gulf states trying to hold on to their positions of oil exporters to really become just now energy exporters. And the role of oil is not really moving. That will continue to be part of the energy mix, including the exports. And that is also going to be really critical because the export revenue that could be generated from a given export value of oil and gas is still really very much higher than anything that is expected to be generated from green hydrogen or any renewable energy. So the finances here are really driving this. But what's also interesting is how will this then really, what does this mean really for the role of the state? Because in my opinion, it's really just cementing the role of the state and the economy rather than really creating a new, maybe it's a more diversified system or economic system, but really from the state and the relation with the society, it's more or less it's the same. And there's still a lot of reform that is needed, I think, to achieve really successful energy transition. The region also There's a lot of social change in some of the countries, most notably Saudi Arabia, that's also taking place. So managing really the expansion and trying to hold on the oil price remaining low. And we've seen that with Saudi, for example, holding on some of its voluntary cuts with OPEC to try to really maintain the price quite high. So how do we then translate all of these projects and targets into also really equal opportunities for the society, and also maintaining, with labor opportunities, for example, but also maintaining quote unquote the peace. And I think for me, it's really just a great opportunity with the rise of the oil price that's allowing the Gulf states to do this. But in a way, it's not really changing. It's almost trying to hold on to business as usual. And with the little remaining time I have, let me pivot a little bit to the oil exporting economies that are more in an economic struggle. Obviously, most notably Iraq, but they also have Libya and Algeria. But the situation there is different because even though the rising of the oil price since last year had really given a boost to these economies, but there are really still structural problems that exist and remain. A lot of these structural problems, interestingly, also exist in the rich oil and gas economies, but there is the economic buffer that the richer countries can do have. But in places like Iraq, for example, a big part of the challenge will be how do we join the global energy transition and fund it? How do we, have exports that are also going to be clean, but also how do we translate that to actual development domestically, knowing that even the oil price, even if it remains high, it's still not enough. There's a huge fiscal deficit and not enough fiscal space to supporting the basic really needs, and you have big, for example, rigid expenditures of the public sector that remaining there, and these obviously are taking away resources from basic development, whether it's social services for water and sanitary or health development and child care, etc. So you have real development needs, and the question here is how could these rich economies then maybe change part of their either efficient resources and efficient expenditures, but also part of their policies to make the management of the oil revenue more balanced and consistent and also sustainable. And then finally, and very briefly, for the oil importing economies in the region, of course, the rise of oil, of energy has contributed in part, not solely, but in part to the rising inflation there. And in many of these states, there also, I think Besma mentioned, the remittances. There have been a lot of benefit really from the booming economies of the Gulf that had helped a lot of the importing economies labor through remittances back to their economy. So the remittances are in places like Lebanon. They're very, very important, but not only in Lebanon, also in Egypt and Jordan, Palestine, and even some parts of North Africa. But the energy sector there had provided an opportunity from pre-COVID, actually, to reduce the government energy bill through expanding of renewable energy infrastructure so that they're importing less oil and gas, particularly gas for electricity, but also now really using that as an opportunity for exports. And there can be some important opportunities. We see it really expanding in Morocco very much, in Tunisia, in Egypt, even in Jordan. But there are questions, in my opinion, about the extent to which these exports might also translate to actual benefit at a socioeconomic level, and ensuring, just energy transition. These are real considerations of people. And even in places like Jordan, for example, with the expansion of energy, renewable energy, you don't see necessarily the average Jordanian paying less in electricity bills. So there, I think, there could be really a problem of also expanding in the existing inequality that's there, and not necessarily having these energy projects really being conducive to producing more labor and economic opportunities and reducing the inequality. So it's a lot of positive, but also a lot of question marks on what could be challenging and why the reform then becomes really important.
Thank you, Manal, for an excellent presentation, and particularly for focusing our attention and expanding our horizons, speaking personally with your focus on these recent trends in oil economies. Particularly, I was personally intrigued by this transition from oil exporters to energy exporters and what that means. So I look forward maybe during the Q&A to hear a little bit more about that, particularly in terms of the economic and political, if you will, implications of that. As I said, our fourth speaker would be Noor Arafi, who will essentially focus on the food crisis, food insecurity in the region, which is a very important part of the panel and the general topic of where the region is heading. Noor, the microphone is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Khalil and Tamara, for inviting me to join this webinar. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with Tariq, Basma, and Manal. So as we all know, low and middle income countries in the MENA region have been grappling with a food crisis. In 2021, around 1/3 of the region's population was moderately or severely food insecure with no regular access to food. And then the situation was exacerbated, and Tariq alluded to this in his presentation. The situation was exacerbated following Russia's war on Ukraine, which coincided with economic and financial crises that had hit several MENA countries. And the war in Ukraine has not only disrupted global food trade, but it has especially affected food insecurity in the MENA region, given the high levels of dependency on imports from Ukraine and Russia. However, while much of the focus has been on the war in Ukraine, on inflation and supply chain disruptions as major triggers of the food crisis in the region, the main argument I want to present is that it's not just about these shocks like COVID and the war in Ukraine. Rather, the food crisis in the MENA region is a protracted, long-term crisis that has engulfed the food system in several MENA countries for decades. So in the presentation, I will try to go beyond the shocks and look more at the structural problems at the origin of the current food crisis. And here, a key argument I want to advance, which is based on an article I co-authored with Maysoon Sukkariya at King's College London, is that the current food crisis is the product of 4 structurally embedded and mutually reinforcing problems that have afflicted the food system. And the 4 problems are food insecurity, a deficiency in food production, and exploitative and devalued agricultural labor, and the lack of environmental sustainability. So the main idea here is to link the issue of food insecurity to broader structural problems concerning food production, agricultural labor, and the environment. And all these problems are actually the result of the nature of the economic system in many MENA countries. So I will start the presentation by highlighting the 4 dimensions or problems at the root of the current food crisis. And I will end with few ideas, if I have the time, about how we need to rethink the food system and create a new food imaginary that is grounded in the ideals of justice and sustainability. And given the limited time I have, I will focus on Lebanon as a case study, but the broader framework and analysis I will present is relevant to make a sense of the problem of food insecurity in other countries in the MENA region. So let me start with the first key dimension of the food crisis. So far, the food crisis has been primarily understood as a problem of food insecurity. And in Lebanon, it has been understood as a direct result of the economic crisis that has hit the country. As we all know, since 2019, Lebanon has experienced an economic and financial collapse that has led to a depreciation of the currency, which has lost more than 98% of its value against the dollar. And it also led to a 500% increase in prices between December 2018 and October 2021. And inflation has hit food products particularly hard. For example, in Lebanon, the monthly price of wheat and chicken increased by more than 26% 27 times between 2019 and 2022. So while food price inflation has also affected most countries in the MENA region, Lebanon experienced the highest food price inflation in the whole world in 2023. So this gives you an idea of how severe the situation is. Now, the continued depreciation of the currency, together with hyperinflation and the lifting of food subsidies, led to a drastic decline in consumer purchasing power, which severely strained access to food. 85% of Lebanese are unable to afford basic food items. Tariq also alluded to this. Over 1/3 of adults have been skipping meals, and some households are even compromising on healthcare and education to pay for food. And food shortages have also, they also became a new reality, specific in Lebanon during the first 2 years of the crisis, just like in other MENA countries that are dependent on food imports. So by December 2022, we have 1/3 of the resident population in Lebanon and almost half of the refugee population who were facing severe food insecurity. So that's the first key dimension to understand the food crisis. But as I said before, this is just one aspect of a protracted food crisis. Another key dimension of the food system crisis is the protracted problem of food production, which stems from the nature of the economic system. Lebanon has a weak track record in food production, and this is largely due to the laissez-faire policies that were adopted that privileged the banking and construction sectors at the expense of agriculture and industry, the productive sectors. So what we have now is an underdeveloped agricultural sector that is characterized by monopoly control and an orientation towards cash crops and export. And this focus on export-oriented, capital-intensive agricultural production has also characterized other MENA countries, specifically after the adoption of economic liberalization policies, which means that the food that is produced is actually produced for exports rather than to meet local demands first. The state's neglect of the agricultural sector has also led to the problem of import dependency, from which Lebanon suffers, just like many other MENA countries. About 80% of the food consumed in Lebanon is actually imported. So the problem is that the dependency on food imports has directly contributed to the current food crisis in Lebanon as well as in other MENA countries, because this dependency increases the country's vulnerability to both internal shocks, such as currency devaluation and economic collapse, as well as external shocks, such as the war in Ukraine and supply chain disruptions. The third key issue here regarding the problem of food production is that there was loss of agricultural land, which is a feature in other MENA countries as well, because of urbanization and the neglect of the agricultural sector. And lastly, the broader system of commercial capitalism and the prevailing orientation towards the production of cash crops have meant that what food is still produced in Lebanon is often produced for profit. And this has provided exporters and big commercial agents with power and rent, while farmers, especially small-scale farmers, are completely marginalized. So what we have in Lebanon now is a system of monopoly control, whereby you have a few holding families, landlords and agribusinesses that have control over the food sector, over importing agricultural inputs, over distribution, while small farmers are not integrated in the value chain, in the food value chain at all. And this, of course, clearly affects the problem, the food crisis. The third dimension, I think, that needs to be taken into account is the issue of agricultural labor, which we sometimes actually forget when we think about the food crisis and food insecurity. And I'll focus specifically on Lebanon here. So in Lebanon, the key issue is that modes of land ownership and land distribution, wars, state policies, and the shift to cash crops have led to massive displacement from rural to urban centers. And such displacement contributed to chronic labor shortages in the agricultural sector, along with loss of local knowledge of environmentally appropriate and sustainable food production practices. And over the years, the loss of agricultural labor was compensated for through the employment of migrants and refugees, Palestinians and Syrians. This dependence on migrant workers exacerbated the devaluation of agricultural labor and labor exploitation, because most farmhands are seasonal workers. They are employed informally. They don't enjoy decent work conditions or any social protection. So you have the heavy dependency on exploited agricultural labor and the devaluation of the status of these workers. All these have led to a lack of investment in technological innovation, contributing to low productivity and a crisis of sustainability. And this is the fourth and the last dimension of the food crisis that I would like to highlight. And the main point here is that the large scale and capital intensive nature of production in Lebanon, as in many other MENA countries, driven by the focus on export agriculture, this has led to a crisis of environmental sustainability, especially relating to the use of unsustainable food production practices. So, for example, the heavy use of agrochemicals like fertilizers and pesticides to maximize crop yields and to maximize profits. This has caused a great harm to the environment because chemicals leak into and contaminate the soil, and this makes it unsustainable to grow crops in the future, and thus it decreases agricultural productivity. Environmental issues also increased because of the rising dependence on monoculture farming, which is a large-scale commercial approach that involves planting one crop over a large area of land. And again, this approach was adopted by several MENA countries. The problem is that it depletes the soil of essential nutrients, it contributes to a loss of biodiversity, and so it raises the likelihood of crop failure, reduces agricultural productivity, and increases the risk of food shortages. So we cannot understand the food crisis without taking into account the problems of environmental sustainability that are exacerbated by the larger system. And the crisis of environmental sustainability in Lebanon is almost clearly manifested actually in the growing deficit of fresh water in the country. The use of agrochemicals, the overpumping of groundwater led to the contamination of water. There's an estimate that maintains that more than 90% of urban water in Lebanon is actually contaminated. And the problem of water pollution is exacerbated by increasing water shortages in Lebanon, not only due to the scarcity of water, but it's also the result of inefficient irrigation systems and poor water governance structures. So the main message, and I will conclude here because I'm aware of the time, Khalil, is that to understand the food crisis, we need to link the problem of food insecurity with other structural problems. I would have wanted to just talk about how we can get out of the food crisis, but I don't have the time, so maybe I can address this in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Noor. Congratulations to all four panelists, not only for their excellent remarks thus far, but on I love to have people focused on the economy because they're precise with their time. So that's my first panel in the past 45 years where all four speakers did abide by the time allocation. So we appreciate that. Noor, I was very fascinated with what you just mentioned or concluded with, and explains in one of my most recent visits to the Arab world, we go to this very nice Arabic food restaurant, and I love those big plates of vegetables where they have cucumbers and tomatoes and lettuce, and so to munch on if you would like to before the meal, and definitely love to munch on these little Middle Eastern cucumbers. And my relative said, don't touch it. People are getting all kinds of poisoning these days, munching on fresh vegetables. So now I understand what that warning meant, I guess, with what you just described to us. I would like to start the Q&A session with a question addressed to all four, if whoever wants to tackle this one. It's about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the number one kind of national security objective on the part of the U.S. administration, which is, of course, that's one of the reasons why it's becoming less maybe successful in Middle East policy these days, the issue of normalization, regional integration. It's the administration is just totally focused on that in almost like irrational way. In light of what we discussed today, all this economic turmoil in the region and people kind of trying hard to recover and to rebuild, where does this fit? Does it have an economic role in the region? Does it impact these economic crises? Is it seen by anybody as a way out of the economic challenges that we're faced in the region, or it is totally irrelevant to that? I know my question is half political, half economic, but I'll leave it up to you to decipher and focus on whatever aspect of it you would like to do that. Tariq, would you like to start?
I mean, Khalil, that's a giveaway question in a way. And I actually was going to bring this up at some point during my opening remarks, but to say something different. Let me take the question head on. The US, without any doubt, has made normalization a priority. It's a priority not just for the countries that have signed normalization accords, but for other countries that are looking, that are considering, or are being lobbied to do so, including and primarily Saudi Arabia in this case. I don't think any rational actor, in my humble opinion, could, with a straight face, promote normalization at this point for anything other than the very narrow objective here of normalizing relations, as opposed to selling normalization as a way out, as a recipe, as a conduit or a response to regional growing economic and developmental challenges that require different approaches, different modalities, different policies, and different positions taken by the US. I mean, if the US was also focused on these other issues and, in fact, making the case for how normalization will help address, let's say, unemployment, environmental degradation, fragility, you name it, I would say we can think through the argument. I don't think they're not even making that effort, Khalid. They're focused on normalization and normalization only in a very narrow sense. And sadly, and I say this, and I think I need to say this, this has only further undermined the position of the US, the standing of the US, the influence of the US. Even countries that have normalized recently see through this and would like the US to be a much more responsible, engaged actor that addresses genuine problems that people in the region see, face, and deal with, and deem a priority for them. The US, unfortunately, is not doing this. And so whatever disagreements we may have about perceptions of US withdrawal from the region, how much of that is fact versus fiction, it's hard to not over time acknowledge the lack of engagement, the lack of attentiveness, the lack of, I would say, focus on anything beyond very narrow objectives. And now they're primarily about don't do business with China and please normalize as soon as you can. This is a recipe for the US and the West, I would argue, losing the Middle East, which a process which I would argue has gathered steam. It is more acceptable and seen as, in fact, desirable across the region, and one that could gather momentum soon, should the US and Europe continue to be focused largely on their narrow, legitimate national security interests, but very narrow, selfish national security interests that don't go to the heart of the problems and the challenges the region faces. Forgive me, Khalil, for being very direct here. No, you gave me a freebie.
Thank you, Tariq. Manal, is there an oil component to this? I mean, because there is more interest, I would say, in the oil-producing countries and normalizations these days. Let's be very frank and admit it. And but how do they? I mean, is that type of step going to help the oil industry down the road, or the gas industry down the road?
I think it will help anything that where technology is required. I think it's going to help. For example, the UAE and Israel have had cooperation on hydroelectricity stuff. With water, the Gulf region really struggles with water, and then the Gulf also does not have a lot of the technology that is really growing domestically. So access to technology, access to collaborative work on the oil industry becoming more cleaner through more of the carbon capture and sequestration technology. I think that's where it's going to be helping. But in terms of actually just really boosting the actual oil and gas industry, I don't really think there is a direct link there. But I do think that aside from the oil and gas, however, I think the diversification story will, if you want a more open tourism, then normalization would make sense from that perspective, because you're, all of a sudden you're really changing, dare I say, the identity of the Gulf from a particularly previous identity to now maybe more tolerant and more open, and the narrative that's coming with that. And you see that in lots of places in UAE, for example. So I think the normalization part here, and also I maybe say something else, is the oil and gas, the large rents that have really been generated to the state in the last almost year and a half now, I think gave the Gulf region a stronger point to negotiate, as has been mentioned already, that they can really say, what, we're now going to expand into whether it's relations with Russia or relations with China, but also the normalization part. I think they're really very pragmatic, and that I think does not hurt the economy. It's not driven by solving the oil and gas business, but I do think it's an opportunity for a lot of support and investments, whether technological or financial, in the clean oil and gas, but also the energy transition parts of things, and of course tourism, etc.
Basma, how about the trade component of normalization? I mean, the U.S. is focusing mostly on regional integration in terms of maritime defense and in terms of this and that, and some people are, as a matter of fact, pulling out of this, as the Emirates has done recently with the maritime defense joint adventure. But how about trade in general? Is it seen as enhancing regional trade?
So look, we have case studies to look at in terms of normalization, which is Egypt and Jordan, right? And
right.
One can argue that, did normalization, and I think it's a great question, and certainly the literature doesn't have a resounding yes or no on the question, but let me just point out a few things. The way that I think it made some benefit, and I say that with a very loose, quote unquote, framing, is when it was tied to access to American markets. So right to your question about trade, is that normalization, for example, between Jordan and Israel, and Egypt and Israel, the benefit really came when the Americans said, oh, we'll give you preferential access to American markets. Now, we know Egypt never quite got that in the sense of the word. Jordan got a free trade agreement. And I do think that for Jordan, yes, you can argue through, GDP growth rates of exports There was a positive effect of that FTA. I'm a bit of a critic on it because I think a lot of what I've seen is actually Asian companies coming to Jordan, really setting up shop and then just exporting right to the American market. How much benefit is that for the average Jordanian? If you look at the qualified industrial zones, not a lot. I say that though, I don't want to be too critical because I'm going to be very personal here, dumbfounded when I found an Indian factory in my parents' village, like right in the center of the village in northern Jordan, was this Indian factory, which apparently pays 150 dinars for the average worker, mostly women, which I was kind of impressed about because they're mostly women who, with all due respect, in northern part of Jordan, don't have access to a lot of jobs. So for them, and I asked about working conditions. I have a lot of cousins that work in this factory. They're quite happy. It's not my standard of, it's a 12-hour day. I think that's really, really excessive, obviously. It shouldn't be allowed. They feed them. They're quite happy. And they think that actually this is really empowering a lot of these young women who are, frankly, sadly, very educated, have finished their university degrees, but then have no jobs because there's no access to anything else in rural parts of Jordan. So, I say that because, I'm looking at family members who are really quite happy. It's a sad statement to see this Indian company in the middle of a village. Like quite literally, it takes out the sun for all the neighboring houses, which is quite sad and not really well done in terms of urban planning, but there you go. So let's look at the examples that are done. Now, and the question of whether Israel's normalization with the more recent countries like UAE and Bahrain had an economic benefit. I want to be very clear. This is really a security arrangement, and specifically by having normalization, the Emiratis and the Bahrainis have access to surveillance technology that they want badly. It's about technology. It's about trade and technology more than anything, and it's not a two-way street. It's simply Israeli companies now able to, under the guise of normalization, help the Emiratis and the Bahrainis get really advanced surveillance technology, digital surveillance technologies, which for all intents and purposes is strengthening digital authoritarianism, which is terrible for civil liberties and civil liberty movements or civil society. So it's devastating on a political liberalization front. So in the eyes of the Gulf countries, normalization with Israel is not about a boom economically. It's about a boom in security. It's about getting the best AI technology from the belly of the beast, if you will, on how to pacify and surveil a population. End of point. Now, in the case of Saudi Arabia, I think it's similarly, if there is a demand, it's increased surveillance similarly as well. But also, NEOM and all these other places are all about smart cities. They're all, including in there a really strong sense of digital authoritarianism. When I see smart cities, every 10, whatever that word is, tentacles, just become all alerted, because in the Middle East, when we see smart cities, guarantee you it's not for an environmental footprint reason. Read between the lines. It's about controlling and monitoring the population. Simple. And the Israelis have perfected that. The Chinese and the Israelis, the two groups, have perfected that. And so they will lean on, absolutely, there's a befriending of the Chinese and the Israelis in the Gulf because they have a demographic challenge of way too many foreigners who have no loyalty to the state. They know that. They don't want to give them citizenship. Much of these guest workers are sometimes second, third, fourth generation at this point. It's getting to be a challenge for them. And if they're going to continue to be able to provide their masses with the kind of luxury and comfort that the nationals expect, it has to be a have and have-nots. And the have-nots are the guest workers who will always be guests. And how do you make sure they're just guests? Well, you got to watch them all the time. Make sure that they're not trying to, frankly, challenge the state.
Thank you, Basma. We have a question for you, Noor, from Abdussalam Al-Bilazi. Could the difficult economic situation in the region that you all spoke about lead to a hungry revolution in some countries? I mean, is it reaching that critical stage?
Thank you, Khalil, and thank you, Abdussalam, for asking this this question. It is actually one of the main reasons behind the Arab uprisings was actually it was economic. It was like against authoritarianism, but there was also the economic and social grievances that were lived by many Arabs. And I think that what the current food crisis, coupled with the debt and financial crisis that is happening, the shock on energy prices, etc., it's actually also it's leading to the growing disgruntlement of the Arab population, and because they are also bearing the brunt of reforms that are now being adopted or like promoted by the IMF, while sparing the elite. But it's also challenging Arab regimes in the sense that the patron clientelist agreement or the patron client agreement or pact that has been so far a foundation for the survival of Arab regimes, this pact is being challenged by the inability of Arab governments now to have the subsidies that they used to have a decade ago, given the debt and fiscal burdens. So we might have increasing number of protests, given the growing disgruntlement, the uncertainty that Tariq and Basma also talked about. I also think it will trigger more disillusionment and disenfranchisement from the Arab population, specifically given the rising authoritarianism, digital surveillance, etc., whereas there is just no room for maneuver, and the poor are bearing the brunt of everything.
Thank you, Noor. Manal, Ziad Boubaker would like to know, and I'm sure that will probably be in your specific area of energy, how accurate and reliable is the data that's collected in the region? And I know each one of you might have a kind of different perception of that or an answer to that, but in your area, how accurate and reliable is the data that you work with?
Well, the question assumes that there are data. A lot of times there just simply are not data. It's really difficult to find. The statistical bureaus across the region vary. And also there are occasionally selective sharing of data. Some data on one front might be available, but others might not be available. So there's a capacity building component that you really need to maybe support a lot of the statistical bureaus to get the data. When it is available, or they are available, the data, the reliability really varies from country to country. A lot of times they're only in Arabic, so you need access to Arabic language to be able to get the data and then kind of translate them. And then also, and I've had this from personal experience, you get, data that are, for example, for national accounts, and then you do the math with the existing data and they just don't match. So, something is missing. But generally speaking, I think what is published is fairly reliable. I think the problem is not with the reliability, but with the transparency. I think, in my opinion, there's a lot of data that are just not shared. And one example is, for example, with the Gulf states, there are no data on sovereign wealth fund investments, for example. We know a big part of that comes from investments from oil and gas revenue, but where does it go and where it's gone, we don't know. There's also a lot of times it's difficult to have reliability of data on households because we don't have really strong taxation system. So if you don't tax people properly and they don't pay taxes, then you don't really have a system of being able to tell you where the data are. So there's structural issues with the reliability of data. But I think my problem is with that is the data that's available is fairly reliably okay, but it's not all there. There are gaps within the available data that are just not available and are not made transparent. And part of that is also, I think, Basma mentioned about the control. I think the control is really in part because obviously data is knowledge, so you don't share a lot of the data, and it's not only vis-a-vis, for example, in the Gulf, the foreign workers or the guest workers, but also the local workers as well, or the nationals.
Thanks, Manal.
Can I add something, Khalid?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Very, I mean, just to, by way of summarizing what Manal said, we know this as a matter of a stylized fact that is quantifiable and observable. We live in the least transparent region in the world, especially when it comes to data, especially when it comes to statistics, especially when it comes to what governments do. Take a look at budgetary transparency. You know, a very basic requirement that most countries would publish for the sake of providing information to the public, to businesses, investors, on what they're doing, not doing, and when they plan to do it. Yet most countries in the region, including the Gulf countries, do not provide the necessary building blocks for people to assess at any point in time what is to be done. This is an example, Khalil, of where even when countries in our region say we want to, you know, we do not want to be like the rest in the West. We want to be like the Asians. Well, the Asian countries actually publish a lot of data. Yeah. For all their flaws, for all their surveillance constraints, they do publish a lot of data because it serves national development. It serves economic policy making. It serves financial markets. I would say this is one of those key entry points for thinking about the future of governance and policy making in the region moving forward. Thank you.
Okay. Basma, William Gant is asking, why aren't we seeing more Western or domestic investment in solar energy in the Middle East? North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula are some of the best places for that. How come that is not picking up as an economic sector?
Well, the West isn't actually the leader in solar energy. It's China. China is actually the both in terms of IP and patenting, in terms of production of actual solar panels, certainly the minerals involved. China leads on that. So it's really a question about whether or not, why hasn't China invested in the Middle East? And China, I mean, it has investments in the Middle East. It's certainly focusing on its Belt and Road initiative. So really focusing on infrastructure development and the rest. I think it's going to, increase with time. Certainly, solar panels are getting cheaper and cheaper as advancements continue. I think the Middle East is missing. I mean, it really needs to come from a government imperative. And I'm certainly not a climate change expert in any way, but I do think, some of the good things that we're seeing from the Gulf countries committing to really investing in green energy is fantastic. A lot of other countries need to as well. I think there's still a very old mentality of understanding the energy landscape. You're absolutely right, or William's absolutely right, in that, one of the things the Middle East has been blessed with is fantastic sunny weather. Why isn't there more solar investment? It makes absolute sense. And I think there's a room for climate change scholars to be really at the forefront. Every Middle East country should be inviting the very best minds. I look at, again, my native country of Jordan, where, water is so precious there. It's constantly an issue. I mean, it's the cause of divorces in Middle East, right? I mean, it's just so precious and so little. It's a constant source of tension, like finding food, finding water, drinkable water is a real issue. So my point is that, yes, countries should be looking into it. It's a restructuring of urban planning. It's a restructuring of conservation efforts, a lot of fantastic programs. The World Bank has some great programs in, recycling. I mean, recycling alone, I would love to go to the Middle East and see blue bins, proper blue bins, let alone green bins, right? I mean, that recycling is still in its infancy. It requires cultural change. It requires enormous amount of education to really educate the public about why throwing garbage is not an act against the state, which I think sadly people still think, oh, I'm going to throw this out my window and it's, somehow a reaction to the state. It's not. It's really the health of the population. So yeah, it's not an easy answer. I just think there's a lot to be said about what can be done on all things with the green economy.
Thank you
May
very
I
much.
add that very briefly,
Yeah,
Khalid?
go ahead. Go ahead, Mana.
And I agree with Basma's points as well, and especially that the Middle East and North Africa region is one of the most impacted by climate change, increasingly so, of course, with the rise of temperatures and everything. But I kind of mentioned this at the very end of my earlier intervention in the beginning, where we see particularly, and this is across the region, but I'll give an example maybe on Jordan, because it was just mentioned, the fact that a lot of, I mentioned, for example, with renewable energy, the average Jordanian or the average Egyptian or Lebanese are not necessarily benefiting from that. A big part of that is because of the industrial structure that we have. We really have, people who are leading, the capital owners are embedded normally with good relations with the state. It's really crony capitalism that really drives a lot of oligarchies that drive the region. And even in the Gulf, you have huge oligopolies. And I've talked about that even in my research, both in a quantitative and qualitative way. So what ends up happening is a lot of these initiatives and where capital might be flowing is not going to necessarily, I don't think personally, it's really directed to support the environment. It's more, where is there an economic opportunity that we can capture more rents? And then, unfortunately, when you have a motivation, so that there's no alliance of motivations, it's something that looks for the environment, but it's not really solving a lot of the environmental issues. And a lot of these issues then become cultural, become really from an industrial and regulatory and competitive infrastructure and regulation perspective. And these are just lacking in the region, unfortunately. So a lot of that, before the investments, I think we really need a reform in the regulatory infrastructure that's there, and on a lot of these issues that have relevance with the climate and energy and recycling and etc.
Thank you. We have a constructive comment that I would like to share with everybody from Marianne Lanatza from Lund University, Sweden. Thanks all of you for your interesting analysis. And was wondering how come we did not mention some of the progressive development in Morocco with green energy, diversification of the economy and trade partners like with the US, China, India, and so on, and in general about North Africa. I assure you, Marianne, that essentially it's just our limited time when you're given only 10 to 12 minutes to cover some of these issues, and you have to deal with 22 different entities in our grouping for this subject matter, Middle East area, so, and North Africa included, of course. We haven't had the chance to do that, but we welcome the opportunity to correspond with you if you have your own research or other people's research that you would like to share with us at Arab Center. Feel free to do so on our website, and we will be more than glad to include these topics in our future discussion of similar issues in the future. We have a ton of other questions we're not going to be able to deal with. At this time, we only have like 2 to 3 minutes left. There is one question, essentially, let me see, about Tariq from Aida Abdul Rahim, asking if you could expand a little bit more on the re-emergence of globalization or the deglobalization and reinstating the role of the state in the economy. Could you comment on that issue?
Khalil, with your permission, can I direct this question to Basma? I think Basma
yes,
is paying
that will be fine.
Debates to this issue.
Yeah, it's directed to you. That's why I addressed it to you. But I know she also covered some aspect of that, particularly the emergence of the role of the state in that. Go ahead, Basma.
So just looking at the question, sorry.
Of globalization and deglobalization, the re-emergence of that and reinstating the role of the state in the economy. Mm-hmm. Do you think that these are specific to particular regions or particular to specific states within the region who initially might have resisted globalization for so long? And what is the role of the state and the leadership in these countries? Is that significant?
So, I mean, deglobalization in theory is the idea that it's countries that at one point embraced, unfettered globalization or free trade and are now backtracking. So, I mean, the United States is a prime example. Many parts of Western Europe are increasingly becoming more introverted, not just politically, but of course economically, which is what we're seeing. I mean, I don't think that the Middle East is deglobalizing nearly as much as the West. In fact, partly because I think their interdependencies are higher. They need the global markets more than the West might need the global markets. I mean, it's all relative, of course, not to suggest that the West doesn't need global markets. So I think that's part of it. Are we going to see the kind of populist nationalists, go it alone policy that we see in the West come to the Middle East? In some way, it's been attempted and tried. I mean, some of us are old enough to remember I wrote a thesis on the import substitution industrialization once upon a time, and that was tried. And I don't think it's seen as very successful, and I don't think there's any hope to go back to that. It's just I think it's too close to distant memory for much of the Middle East to sort of see industrial policy and this return to the state investing in manufacturing the same way, in a very positive light, in the same way that many of the Western countries think about it.
All right, thank you, Basma. Our time is up, unfortunately, as the discussion was getting deeper, and we have, like I said, a ton of questions. I apologize for all of those in the audience who sent their questions that we can't target them right now or deal with them at this point. And special thanks to Tariq, to Noor, to Manal, to Basma for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. I've learned a lot from this discussion, and I hope all members of the audience today, whether domestic or global, have benefited from these presentations and discussion. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you again in future webinars and future events at Arab Center.